A chasm emerges, the deterioration of U.S.-Ukraine relations. The February 28 meeting between President Trump and President Zelenskyy at the White House was supposed to be a display of unity. Instead, it exposed a deep and growing rift in the U.S.-Ukraine relationship. Tensions, simmering for months, boiled over. Trump, frustrated by the ongoing conflict and eager to extract tangible benefits for the United States, demanded concessions from Zelenskyy. At the heart of the dispute was the issue of continued U.S. military and intelligence aid to Ukraine. Trump, skeptical of the effectiveness of further aid and eager to force a negotiated settlement, abruptly halted all assistance. This decision sent shockwaves through Kyiv and beyond, signaling a potential shift in U.S. policy. The meeting ended in acrimony, leaving the future of the U.S.-Ukraine partnership hanging in the balance. The world watched with bated breath, wondering if this marked a turning point in the conflict. The stakes were incredibly high. The outcome of the war and the fate of Ukraine seemed more uncertain than ever. A desert summit, the Jeddah talks, and the quest for peace. Against a backdrop of escalating tensions, diplomats and officials from around the world converged on Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. The mission to find a path to peace in war-torn Ukraine. The Jeddah talks, convened on March 11, 2025, represented a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak landscape. The choice of Saudi Arabia as a neutral venue underscored the global nature of the conflict and the desire for a peaceful resolution. The Saudis, with their own complex geopolitical interests, sought to position themselves as mediators in this high-stakes diplomatic drama. The talks brought together representatives from Ukraine, the United States, Russia, and several other key players. Notably absent was President Zelenskyy himself, who opted to send a high-level delegation led by Andriy Yermak, his chief of staff. Zelenskyy, wary of appearing weak, chose to remain in Kyiv, a symbol of Ukrainian resilience in the face of Russian aggression. The aid freeze, a lever of pressure or a recipe for disaster. The Biden administration's decision to suspend military and intelligence aid to Ukraine cast a long shadow over the Jeddah talks. The aid freeze, announced in the wake of the contentious White House meeting, was widely seen as a tactic to pressure Zelenskyy into making concessions. The move sparked outrage in Congress, with both Democrats and Republicans condemning it as short-sighted and dangerous. Critics argued that it would only embolden Putin and weaken Ukraine's negotiating position. Senator Lindsey Graham, a staunch advocate for Ukraine, warned that abandoning Kyiv would be akin to the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan. The administration, however, defended the aid freeze as a necessary step to force a negotiated settlement. Secretary of State Antony Blinken insisted that the pause was temporary and that the United States remained committed to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. He stressed the need for both sides to make difficult choices to achieve a lasting peace. The allure of resources, Ukraine's minerals, and the American interest. Beyond the immediate crisis, a longer-term strategic calculation was also at play in the Jeddah negotiations: Ukraine's vast reserves of rare earth minerals. These minerals, essential for everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to advanced weapon systems, had become a focal point of U.S. foreign policy. The Trump administration, eager to reduce America's dependence on China for these critical resources, saw an opportunity in war-torn Ukraine. They pushed for a deal that would grant American companies preferential access to Ukrainian mineral deposits in exchange for increased economic and military assistance. Special Envoy Zalmay Khalilzad, tasked with leading the negotiations for the United States, stressed the importance of the minerals deal to the Trump administration. He argued that it would be a win-win for both countries, providing Ukraine with much-needed investment and the United States with a secure source of critical minerals. Section 5. Voices of Discord, Clashing Perspectives from Washington to Kyiv. The Jeddah talks played out against a backdrop of conflicting perspectives and deep-seated mistrust. In Washington, the debate over Ukraine policy intensified, with hawks and doves battling for the president's ear. President Trump, focused on his America First agenda, remained skeptical of further U.S. involvement in the conflict. He viewed the war as a costly distraction from his domestic priorities and saw little strategic value in defending Ukraine. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, while acknowledging the need for a negotiated settlement, stressed the importance of holding Russia accountable for its aggression. He insisted that any peace deal must preserve Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, the mood was a mixture of defiance and desperation. President Zelenskyy, facing mounting pressure from both within and outside Ukraine, found himself in an impossible position. He was determined to defend his country's independence, but also acutely aware of the limitations of Ukrainian military power. Section 6. Zelenskyy's Gambit, a ceasefire proposal to break the impasse. In a bid to break the deadlock in the Jeddah talks, President Zelenskyy unveiled a comprehensive ceasefire proposal. The proposal, carefully crafted to address the concerns of all parties involved, represented a bold attempt to find a peaceful solution to the conflict. The plan called for a complete cessation of hostilities, including air and sea operations, along the entire line of contact. It also stipulated an end to attacks on critical infrastructure, including power plants and water treatment facilities. To address the humanitarian crisis, the proposal included provisions for the release of all prisoners of war and the establishment of safe corridors for the delivery of aid. The ceasefire proposal was met with cautious optimism by the international community. However, significant hurdles remained. The issue of Crimea, annexed by Russia in 2014, remained a major sticking point. Moreover, deep mistrust between the parties, exacerbated by years of conflict and propaganda, threatened to derail even the most well-intentioned efforts at peace. Section 7. The stakes on the table, concessions, elections, and the specter of territorial compromise. As the Jeddah talks dragged on, the true scope of the negotiations became apparent. It was no longer simply about a ceasefire, but about the future of Ukraine itself. The United States, eager to extricate itself from the conflict, pushed for a negotiated settlement that would inevitably require concessions from both sides. One particularly contentious issue was the holding of elections in the Donbas region, a key demand of Russia. The United States argued that free and fair elections, held under international observation, could help to legitimize any peace deal and pave the way for a lasting settlement. However, Ukraine and its allies viewed the demand for elections with suspicion, fearing that Russia would use its influence to manipulate the outcome. They argued that elections could only be held after the withdrawal of Russian troops and the restoration of Ukrainian control over the Donbas. Section 8. Beyond the Arabian Sands, the global implications of the Jeddah negotiations. The outcome of the Jeddah talks had far-reaching implications that extended well beyond the borders of Ukraine. The conflict had become a proxy war between the West and Russia, a test of wills with global consequences. A negotiated settlement, if achieved, could usher in a new era of détente between the United States and Russia, easing tensions and reducing the risk of a wider conflict. However, a failure to reach an agreement could further escalate the conflict, with potentially catastrophic consequences for global security. The talks were also being closely watched by other countries in Eastern Europe, many of which feared that a Russian victory in Ukraine would embolden Putin to pursue further aggression. The outcome of the negotiations could determine the future security architecture of Europe for years to come. Section 9. A world on hold. Uncertainty reigns as the future hangs in the balance. As the sun set on Jeddah, the outcome of the talks remained uncertain. The negotiators, exhausted from days of intense discussions, had made some progress on technical issues but remained divided on the fundamental questions at the heart of the conflict. The world watched and waited, hoping for a breakthrough but bracing for the worst. The fate of Ukraine and the future of peace in Europe hung in the balance. The stakes could not have been higher. Please like, subscribe, and comment to support our channel.